They never found the hammer. Just the skull caved in like rotten fruit and the blood that soaked the porch planks deep enough to stain the wood for years. His name was Jonas, though the white folks never said it. They called him the Quiet One, the blacksmith's shadow, the mute boy from Bellwood. But after that night, after Master Bellwood's head was split wide open by the very tool he once used to terrorize his slaves, Jonas became something else, a whisper, a warning, a name carved in the spine of Southern fear, Jonas the Skull-Splitter. They brought him in on a cloudy Sunday, the kind where the air sticks to your back like wet linen and the trees lean like they're eavesdropping. Jonas didn't cry, didn't beg, just stared at the dirt, while the other boys whispered about where his tongue might have gone. Some said he bit it off to keep a secret. Others said the last master burned it out, but no one really knew, and Jonas never told. He was no taller than the barrel in the smokehouse, but he moved like he had roots in his feet, heavy, slow, deliberate. They gave him a burlap sack to wear and sent him to the forge, where the real sweat lived, where the coals glowed like open wounds, and the hammer on the wall gleamed with more authority than the man who owned it. Master Bellwood was a red-faced brute with hands like cured ham and a voice that made dogs whimper. He looked Jonas over once, squinting like the boy offended him just by existing, then spat and said, "Put the mute with the metal. He'll learn." But Jonas didn't learn the way they wanted. He didn't flinch when hot ash kissed his bare arms, didn't scream when the tongs snapped too close, didn't speak, not once, even when the overseer clipped him behind the ears hard enough to make the world tilt. What Jonas did do was watch. Everything, every blow of the hammer, every hiss of steam, every glance between Bellwood and the slaves. At night, he lay beneath the slats of the quarters, eyes open, tracing the crawl of spiders across the ceiling. He never slept deep, and he never, ever dreamed, or if he did, he never showed it. They called him strange, touched. One of the older women said he'd been born under a hanging tree. Another claimed he'd come from the swamp, carried in by the mist, like a curse that didn't speak because it already knew too much. The only thing Jonas ever touched with tenderness was the fire. He fed it like it was a child. He knelt before it like it was a god. And when no one watched, he stared at the master's sledgehammer mounted high, too heavy for any of the boys to lift, and he smiled, not with his mouth, but with his eyes, just once. And that was enough to make Eli, the oldest slave, mutter under his breath, "Lord help us. That boy's waiting for something." They beat him to make him talk, first with switches, then with belts, and later with the flat end of a shovel when Master Bellwood said the boy needed to learn respect. But Jonas only blinked through the blood. He never ran, never cried, never begged. The overseer, a man named Hatch with tobacco teeth and a snake-bite scar on his neck, said the boy must be simple in the head, but there was nothing slow about the way Jonas watched. That was the part that unsettled the others. He didn't blink like a child. He didn't look away when others were whipped. He looked through, past the pain, into the bones of it. Hatch hated that, said the boy's eyes were too quiet, like the still before a hog slaughters itself in fear. On the third week, they dragged Jonas out at dusk and tied him to the hitch post. The dirt was still warm from the day's heat, and the sky hung low with the smell of wet iron. Bellwood himself came out, shirtless and red from drink. He carried the branding iron in one hand and a jug in the other. "This here's a house of order," he slurred. "And order needs sound. A man who don't speak can't be trusted, can't confess." He pressed the brand against the fire until it glowed like the sun, then brought it to Jonas's chest. The sound it made was like meat frying. The boy didn't scream, didn't even move, just stared at Bellwood, eyes unblinking, until the master's hand trembled and the brand dropped from his grip. Hatch said later he saw something pass between them, something old, something neither man nor boy should carry. That night, the quarters were silent. No singing, no whispers. The other boys didn't sleep near Jonas. One of them, little Matthew, told his mother that Jonas had no shadow, that when the moonlight hit him, it went around instead of through, but that was just fear talking. The truth was worse. The boy wasn't hollow. He was full, full of everything he wasn't allowed to say, full of names buried in shallow graves, full of screams stitched into silence, and somewhere deep, beneath the welts and ash, he carried something heavier than chains, something waiting. Eli, who'd seen too many masters and buried too many sons, sat outside his door and whispered to the dark, "Lord, if you're listening, make that boy forget what he's seen, or give him the strength to use it." But Jonas didn't forget. The next morning, when the fire was lit and the sledgehammer glinted above the forge, the boy stood beneath it, silent, still, and smiling with his eyes again. The forge was older than the house, older than the fields. Some said it was the first thing built on Bellwood land, back when the soil still wept blood from the wars before cotton. It smelled of iron, sweat, and something older, something bitter that clung to the walls like old smoke. In the center hung the master's sledgehammer, mounted above the doorway like a cross in a godless chapel. It wasn't for work, it was for show. Its handle was thick oak, worn smooth near the grip, but the head was clean, untouched by fire or rust. Master Bellwood told visitors it was the soul of the forge, though no one had ever seen him swing it. He just liked knowing it was there, above everyone. Jonas stared at it every morning, not with longing, but recognition, as if he'd seen it before, maybe in a nightmare, maybe in another life. He never reached for it, never dared. But when the wind moved through the slats just right, and the smoke curled low from the coals, Jonas would stand beneath it, like it was his name carved in iron. Hatch caught him once, just looking, said, "That ain't yours, boy." Jonas didn't blink. Hatch stepped closer, lowered his voice. "Only the master swings that one. You so much as breathe near it again, I'll break your damn fingers." Jonas didn't flinch. He simply turned back to the fire and kept stoking the coals. But something shifted in the room then. The other boys in the forge started whispering about the sledgehammer, how it had been used once, years ago, to kill a runaway, how the blood stained the grip, and that's why the master never touched it again. Eli said that was half true. He said the blood hadn't come from the runaway. It came from the master's own father, that the hammer had been passed down like a crown of rust. "That thing don't belong to no man," Eli muttered. "It waits for one." Jonas listened. He always listened. At night, the sledgehammer visited his dreams, not swinging, just hovering, watching. The wooden handle dripped with something thick. The iron head hummed like a heartbeat. Each morning after, Jonas woke up with his fists clenched and ash beneath his nails. The other boys started avoiding him in the forge. One claimed the hammer moved an inch lower every night. Another swore he heard it whispering through the soot. Hatch laughed when he heard it until he caught Jonas alone, cleaning the tools with a strange calm, hands steady, movements slow. He didn't say a word to the boy, just backed away, watching those eyes that never spoke but always saw. That day, Hatch ordered the hammer be chained to its mount. When the overseer left, Jonas reached out and touched the iron links once. Then he smiled with his eyes again. The first time Jonas heard it, he thought it was the wind slipping through the forge vents. But the fire was low, and the doors were shut, and the sound came not from outside, but from the hammer itself. A low, pulsing hum, like breath held too long in the lungs of something ancient. It wasn't music, it wasn't voice, it was memory, burned into iron. Jonas stopped mid-swing, the smaller hammer in his hand frozen above the anvil. The other boys kept working, didn't seem to notice. But Jonas tilted his head, listening, and the sound grew louder. It came in waves, soft but steady, the same rhythm as the beating in his chest. It wasn't calling to him. That would have meant mercy. No, this thing was remembering, and Jonas was the only one who could hear it. That night, the forge wouldn't go cold. Hatch ordered it doused twice, but the embers clung to life like something stubborn and spiteful. Jonas stayed behind to tend it, supposedly as punishment for moving too slow. But really, Hatch just didn't want him near the quarters anymore. "Boy makes the walls itch," Hatch muttered. "Can't sleep right when he's around." Alone, Jonas sat before the coals and stared at the hammer. Even chained, it seemed taller than the doorway. The iron links around its grip didn't scare him. If anything, they made it look more like a thing buried wrong. He leaned forward and listened again. The hum came quicker now, almost like whispering, though no words formed, just the shape of them, just the breath behind them. Then came the flicker, a memory not his own, rising through the flame like smoke, a hand wrapped in blood, a scream choked in gravel, the thud of something heavy meeting flesh. Again and again and again, Jonas blinked. The coals snapped, sending sparks across his knees, but he didn't move. Behind him, the shadows on the walls danced in strange ways, bent like crooked men bowing low. He didn't turn to look. He knew better. When the fire finally died, Jonas took a pinch of ash and smeared it across his wrist, a line straight down like a wound healed the wrong way. Eli found him like that in the morning, sitting cross-legged in the soot, calm as still water. He said nothing, just helped Jonas to his feet and dusted him off. But later that day, Eli whispered to one of the women, "That boy's hearing the forge now, same way my brother did," before he vanished. The woman made the sign of the cross, though her hands trembled. And still, the hammer hummed low, steady, patient, like it knew its time was coming, like it knew Jonas was listening. Eli had no teeth left, but his voice still cut sharp. He spoke in riddles mostly, the kind you didn't answer with words but with silence. Jonas listened, always did. Eli was the oldest on Bellwood, skin like cracked leather and eyes cloudy with stories he wouldn't tell. Most days, he just sat in the shade, hands folded like prayer, watching the sun move across the dirt like it owed him something. But one morning, after seeing Jonas come out of the forge with ash on his face and blistered palms, Eli crooked a finger and said, "Come." He led the boy behind the smokehouse, past the dry well, and into the cotton rows gone brown. There was a stump there, old and scarred, with something carved deep into its surface. Not letters, not words. Just a circle inside a square, split with a jagged line down the middle. Eli tapped it once. "You know what that is?" Jonas shook his head. Eli smiled without smiling. "Didn't think so. But you heard it, haven't you? In the iron, in the fire." Jonas didn't nod, didn't flinch, just waited. Eli bent close and whispered, "You ever see a man without a tongue?" Jonas turned his head. Eli pulled back the rag from his neck, revealing a twisted scar that ran from ear to jaw like someone had tried to carve out silence and failed. "They took it when I was your age. Thought if I couldn't speak, I couldn't remember. But memory don't live in the mouth, boy. It lives in the blood." He placed a hand over Jonas's chest. "Right here. It stays warm, even after the body forgets." Then he reached into the dirt beside the stump and pulled out a flat stone, wrapped in old cloth. Inside was a piece of wood, no longer than a finger bone, carved with the same strange symbol. "It's a prayer," Eli said, "but not the kind for mercy. It's the kind for remembering, for holding fire in your bones." He handed it to Jonas, who turned it over once, then pressed it to his palm like it belonged there. Eli looked at him long and quiet. "You don't need to speak to be heard. But when your time comes, boy, you better not whisper." That night, Jonas tucked the carved wood beneath his bedding, close to his skin, and for the first time since he arrived at Bellwood, he dreamed. In the dream, the forge was a mouth, and the hammer was a tongue, and something deep inside it was trying to scream, but the voice that came wasn't Bellwood's, it was his own. The branding mark blistered for days. It festered yellow, peeled, then bled again whenever Jonas moved too fast or breathed too deep. It sat just above his ribs, raw and red. The twisted B of Bellwood burned into him like ownership. The other boys winced when they saw it. Some offered rags soaked in stream water. Others just looked away. But Jonas didn't cover it. He let it show, let it ache, let it speak for him. At night, he traced the edges of the scar with a fingertip and listened to the hammer hum through the walls. It had grown louder now, not constant but pulsing, like breath or heartbeat. He'd started hearing it even outside the forge, in the garden soil, in the groan of floorboards beneath his feet. in the ringing that followed the crack of the whip on other boys' backs. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence. One morning, while the air still held the wet chill of dawn, Jonas was called to the porch. Bellwood sat with his boots on the railing, drinking before sunup, his shirt unbuttoned and mouth already sour with liquor. He pointed at Jonas and said, "You think that mark on you means pain? It means purpose. It means I gave you a place." Jonas stared past him, toward the trees. Bellwood narrowed his eyes. "You got devil in you, boy. I see it. I seen it in your mama too. That quiet rage. Thought I could burn it out of her. Guess it passed on." Jonas didn't move, didn't blink. Bellwood chuckled and leaned forward, voice dropping low. "You keep looking at my hammer like it's yours. Don't get ideas. That thing's taken more life than you've drawn breath." He leaned closer. "Your silence don't scare me, Muty. Silence is weak. You want power? You speak it. You name it." And then, with no warning, he jabbed a finger hard against Jonas's brand. The boy didn't cry, but his eyes burned, and Bellwood felt it. Just for a second, his breath hitched, and his hand dropped. "You stare at me like you got plans," he muttered, "but you ain't got nothing, just ash and scars." He waved Jonas off, but the boy didn't move. Not until Bellwood turned his head, breaking the gaze. Only then did Jonas walk away. That night, the fire in the forge flared higher than usual. The others said the wind shifted. That something in the air made it burn hotter. But Eli knew better. He watched from a distance as Jonas stood alone before the flames, shirt off, letting the brand cook in the heat like he was trying to burn it deeper or burn it clean. Above him, the sledgehammer swayed on its chain ever so slightly. Not from wind, not from movement, but from something waking, something that had waited long enough. They called it the blood bucket. It sat near the back of the forge, half hidden beneath a warped bench leg and a stack of bent horseshoes no one ever fixed. It didn't belong to any station, wasn't used for water, and never moved from its place. At first, Jonas thought it was just rusted red, but rust didn't clot, and rust didn't stink sweet in the heat. The smell turned thicker near sundown, when the shadows stretched long and the coals burned low. The others avoided it. Even Hatch, who mocked ghosts and scripture alike, refused to touch it. "Old blood," he muttered once. "Old blood don't dry right." Jonas saw it up close on the third week, when a spark leapt from the anvil and landed on the hem of his sack shirt. The overseer knocked him sideways, then grabbed a rag to smother the flame. The rag came from the corner where the bucket Saturday. When Hatch lifted it, something small fell out and clinked against the floor. It didn't bounce, just rolled once, then stopped. A tooth, not yellowed, not old, still slick at the root. The room went silent. Hatch stared at it, then kicked it hard beneath the bench. "Keep your damn eyes forward," he barked, but no one moved. The air was heavy. Jonas didn't blink. That night, he waited until the forge was empty, the others gone to quarters. He returned barefoot, careful not to disturb the gravel. The hammer hummed above him, fainter now, like it was holding breath. Jonas knelt beside the bucket. Inside was a dark, syrupy mix that didn't ripple like water. He dipped 2 fingers in. Thick, cold, he rubbed it on his forearm, beside the brand. The blood sank into the skin as if it belonged there. Beneath the bucket, tucked against the wall, he found a square of leather stiff, curled at the edges, with something scratched into it. A circle with jagged lines through the center, the same symbol Eli had shown him. The forge creaked around him. The hammer twitched on its chain. And somewhere in the wall behind him, something knocked soft, 3 times. Jonas didn't startle. He placed the leather into his waistband, wiped his fingers on his chest, and returned to the fire. He sat cross-legged, facing the coals like an altar, and stared into the orange until his eyes watered. Behind him, the shadows danced longer than they should have. Something shifted near the bucket, but Jonas didn't look back. He knew what waited in things left to rot. He'd seen it in the eyes of the dying, heard it in the cracks of the lash. And now he heard it in the forge. Not words, Not yet, but the shape of a name. His. Behind the slave quarters stood an old tree with no leaves and no name. It hadn't grown in years, just stood there like it was listening. The bark was split in places, like something had tried to claw its way out. Around the trunk hung rusted chains. 3 of them bolted into the wood so long ago that the bark had grown over parts of the metal. The children called it the chain tree, said if you stood beneath it too long, you'd hear crying from the roots. Others said it was where the first slave ever brought to Bellwood was hung, and that the tree had refused to die after. Jonas was drawn to it like iron to flame. He started walking there at night, alone, barefoot. The dirt around its base was dry and pale, different from the rest of the yard. Nothing grew near it. No grass, no weeds, not even the stubborn thorns that crawled over everything else. One night, while the others slept, Jonas knelt beside it and placed his palm flat on the ground. He stayed like that until the moon passed behind the clouds. Then he began to dig. He didn't use a shovel, just his hands. Quiet, steady. The earth was hard, packed thick with years of secrets. But Jonas kept going, fingers bleeding, nails breaking, until he hit something soft. Cloth. Then bone. He sat back on his heels and looked at what he'd uncovered. Small. Fragile. A child's skull, half crushed on one side, with a ribbon of leather still tangled through what was left of the hair. He didn't cry. He didn't pray. He just wrapped it in his shirt and placed it carefully beneath the tree, as if returning it to where it belonged. Then he kept digging. By the time the rooster crowed, there were 6 small mounds around the base of the tree, 6 tiny bundles of bone and cloth. 6 secrets the ground could no longer keep. Jonas stood, covered in soil and blood, and stared at the chains overhead. They didn't sway, didn't rattle, but something in the air had shifted. The wind moved slower. The stars felt farther away. And when he looked back toward the quarters, he saw Eli standing in the doorway, watching. The old man said nothing, just nodded once, slow and heavy, like a man watching prophecy unfold. That morning, no one spoke to Jonas. The other boys stepped aside when he passed. One of them left food at his cot without a word. Something unspoken had bloomed overnight. Not fear. Not quite, but recognition, like they all knew the earth had given something back, and Jonas was the one who asked for it. The bones beneath the chain tree stayed buried, but Jonas could still feel them, in his palms, in his sleep, in the space between each heartbeat, like a rhythm he'd always known but only now remembered. The ground had accepted his silence, and in return, it whispered truths no one else seemed willing to hear. He no longer walked like a boy. He moved like someone carrying something too heavy to set down. Eli noticed it first. "You've been touched by the underneath," he muttered one morning, watching Jonas stoke the forge fire with the same calm he used to dig graves. "Some things ain't meant to be found, boy." But Jonas wasn't listening to Eli. Not anymore. He was listening to the hammer. It had changed since the digging. Its hum no longer came only at night. Now it thrummed softly through the walls during work hours, pulsing in time with every swing of metal on metal. No one else seemed to hear it. Or maybe they did, and chose to pretend they didn't. Even Hatch, who once barked orders like a drunk dog, kept his distance now. He stopped striking Jonas with the flat of his hand, stopped meeting his eyes altogether. Something about the boy's stillness had begun to unnerve him. That week, Jonas spent most of his hours in the back of the forge, sorting scrap iron and hammering nails until his fingers bled. He kept the carved leather square Eli had given him tucked in his waistband, always close. When the hammer hummed, he pressed his hand to it, and when the blood from his fingertips touched the hot iron, he swore the flames flared brighter, just for a moment. The forge itself seemed to know him now, not as servant, as something else. One night, while the others slept, Jonas returned to the chain tree. He didn't dig this time. He brought string, thin, red thread, stolen from the corner of a torn apron. He tied a loop around each of the 6 grave mounds. Not tight, just enough to mark them. Then he sat, cross-legged beneath the chains, and waited for something. He didn't know what, but he knew it would come. And it did. A dog, silent and thin, limped out of the trees. It didn't bark, just sniffed each mound, circled Jonas once, then lay down beside him like it had been waiting. Together, they stared at the forge in the distance, its chimney still smoking faintly in the moonlight. Jonas didn't speak. He never did. But something in the air that night felt louder than words, like the wind was gathering itself, like the silence was stretching too far. And somewhere deep below, the bones listened back. The laughter came like a crack in the air, sharp, sudden, cruel. Master Bellwood was drunk again, his boots muddy from the fields, and his breath thick with smoke and bourbon. The porch was lit with lanterns, and music drifted from the parlor windows, the clumsy kind of music white folks called celebration. A guest had arrived from Georgia, a banker with a silver tooth and too many questions about stock. Bellwood poured him liquor and dragged Jonas out to serve. The boy had been stoking the forge just an hour before, his hands blistered and blackened. Now he stood barefoot on the veranda, holding a tray of glasses, while Bellwood paraded him like a prize hog. "Don't speak," Bellwood slurred. "Don't sing, don't even grunt. But smart as a whip. Works the forge like it's in his blood." The banker laughed, leaned close, and poked Jonas in the chest. "You sure he ain't cursed?" Bellwood grinned. "Course he is. That's what makes him good." The men roared. Jonas didn't move. His eyes stayed low, but his fingers gripped the tray tight enough to make the glass tremble. Bellwood saw it and took the moment to press further. He leaned down and spat tobacco juice near Jonas's feet. "You're lucky, boy. Most your kind wouldn't last a week here. But you keep quiet. That's useful." Then he smacked the bottom of the tray hard, nearly spilling it. Jonas flinched just barely, and Bellwood caught it. His grin widened. "There he is. There's the fire. I knew it was in there." The banker raised his brow. "Fire's dangerous. Not if you chain it right," Bellwood said. He grabbed Jonas by the chin, hard enough to bruise, and lifted his face. "Ain't that right, boy?" Jonas didn't blink. But something behind his eyes shifted, like a door swinging open in the dark. Bellwood's fingers lingered too long, his nails digging into the boy's jaw, and for a moment, just a moment, the air around them went still. The laughter died down. The music inside slowed. Even the crickets fell silent. Then Bellwood released him and turned back to the drinks. "Go on," he barked. "Back to your hole." Jonas walked away, tray steady, but his shoulders tight as rope. The glass clinked faintly with each step. In the shadows beyond the porch, Eli waited. He hadn't been called, but he always came when Jonas was summoned. As the boy passed, Eli leaned in and whispered, "They love laughing before the storm." Jonas didn't answer. He didn't have to. The wind had shifted. The forge fire was already lit. And for the first time, the hammer above the doorway had turned slightly in its chains, angled just enough to catch the lantern light and shine like a waiting blade. The girl had been gone for weeks before anyone said her name out loud. Ruthie, just 10 summers old, quick-footed, sharp-tongued, with a laugh that rose like birds in the morning. One day, she was there running barefoot through the rows, sneaking bits of cornbread from the kitchen door, and the next, nothing. No scream. No struggle, just silence. Master Bellwood said she was sold south, claimed she had a crooked spine, bad for work, better off with new hands. But no one had seen a wagon. No paper was signed. And Ruthie's shoes, stitched from torn sugar sacks and patched with red thread, were found still sitting by her cot. Jonas remembered her voice, high but never soft. She used to call him the Forge Ghost, teasing that he looked like soot come to life. She was the only one who ever touched his hand without flinching. Now, the space where she'd slept was empty, and the chain tree had one more stone pressed beneath it, but something of Ruthie had not left. That became clear the night Jonas heard the knocking inside the forge wall. It came just after dusk, when the fire was down to embers and the boys had returned to the quarters. Jonas stayed behind to sweep, or so he pretended. He was watching the hammer again, watching how it didn't sway, didn't hum, didn't move, until it did. Not much, just a twitch of the chain, a metal groan. Then came the knock. 3 soft raps, spaced slow, like a child tapping to be let out. Jonas froze, not from fear, from recognition. He turned toward the far wall, where the stone met wood and soot blackened everything like an old scar. The knocks came again, same rhythm. Then silence. He walked toward it, pressing his ear to the cold brick. For a long moment, there was nothing, just breath. Then, a whisper. It didn't come through the ears. It came through the bones. A name without sound, a memory without voice. Ruthie. Jonas backed away, eyes wide but dry. He did not cry. He returned to the fire, took a length of iron rod, and pressed it into the coals until it glowed. Then he burned a small mark into the wall, one circle, one line. The symbol Eli had shown him, a prayer of memory, a mark of warning. The next morning, the wall was blackened where he'd burned it, but the mark remained. And for the first time, the hammer above the doorway did not hum. It was still, waiting, listening, and somewhere, behind brick and ash, Ruthie did the same. Jonas didn't draw like the other boys. He didn't sketch horses or faces in the dirt with sticks. What he made were symbols, lines, and circles, slashes and spirals, etched into wood, into ash, into the underside of his own cot, where no eyes could see. He'd started tracing them after the knock from Ruthie, not because he understood what they meant, but because his hands moved without asking. The forge taught him, the fire showed him, and somewhere deep inside, something remembered. Eli found one of the drawings carved into the floor behind the anvil. He stared at it for a long time, then sat down beside Jonas and whispered, "That's not a drawing, boy. That's a map." Jonas didn't respond, but his shoulders stiffened. Eli leaned in closer. "You mapping where they're buried or where they're bound?" Jonas turned his head slowly and pointed at the forge wall, where the burn marks still lingered from the night Ruthie knocked. Eli exhaled through his nose, slow and heavy. "Lord have mercy." Over the next week, Jonas drew more. On the insides of door frames, on scraps of leather, even on the back of Hatch's coat when he wasn't looking. Always the same shape, a circle split by 2 jagged lines, surrounded by smaller, broken symbols. The older women began to murmur, said the boy was putting spells on the house, said he'd been marked. One even swore she saw ash moving under his fingers, rearranging itself like it had memory of its own. But no one dared stop him, not after what happened to Caleb. Caleb was just a boy, younger than Jonas, loud in the mouth and cruel when no one watched. He mocked the drawings, stepped on one near the stables and spat. That night, he woke screaming, scratching at his own skin, claiming something was crawling under it. He clawed his arms raw before Hatch tied him down. By morning, he'd gone quiet, blank-eyed. He never spoke again. The next day, someone found one of Jonas's drawings beneath Caleb's cot, burned into the wood without fire. Eli warned him, but even his voice had changed. "Quieter. You're waking things, boy," he said, "things that remember too much." Jonas kept drawing. He couldn't stop. The symbols poured from his hands like blood from a wound. He no longer slept. He no longer ate full meals. The forge called him, and the hammer above the door seemed closer each morning, though no one dared measure it, and through it all, the lines grew darker, the circles tighter, the marks more precise, until finally, one night, Jonas etched something different, a face, but not Bellwood's, his own, split down the middle, smiling on one side, screaming on the other. Eli died without a sound, no coughing, no fever, just went still in his sleep, eyes open, hands folded across his chest like he'd been waiting for permission. They buried him at dawn, in the field behind the chain tree, where the soil turned black when it rained. No preacher, no hymns, just 3 shovels and a long silence. Jonas didn't cry, but he sat beside the grave after the others had gone, his fingers pressed to the dirt, like he was trying to feel what Eli hadn't said. That night, the forge fire burned hotter than it should have. The wood was damp, but the flames snapped high like dry bone. Jonas worked alone, hammering scraps not for tools, but for shape, twisting them into symbols, binding them into strange forms he buried behind the walls. When the wind blew, it carried the scent of scorched leather and old iron. Ruthie knocked once, then fell silent again. After midnight, Jonas slipped into Eli's old sleeping space, now stripped bare. But beneath the floorboard, he found it a bundle, wrapped in torn cloth, tied with what looked like sinew. Inside was a Bible, cracked down the spine, the pages warped from sweat and smoke. But it wasn't the word that mattered. Someone, Eli, or someone before him, had written between the verses. Thin ink, scrawled in corners, along margins, behind the cover. Names, dates, symbols, and a phrase repeated over and over. What was taken must return. On the last page, in blood-dark ink, someone had drawn a map, not of the land, not of Bellwood, but of something older. A circle of fire, a hammer at the center, chains wrapping inward like roots. At the bottom, one line, the hand that swings must remember. Jonas stared at the page until the edges blurred. The pages smelled of iron and smoke. He ran his thumb along the final drawing, then pressed it to the mark burned on his own chest. The skin pulsed. He stood, took the Bible, and walked barefoot to the forge. The fire flared without him touching it. The hammer above the door rattled once, then stilled. Jonas placed the book beneath it, directly below the shadow, the handle cast on the floor. He knelt, and whispered something no one else heard. By morning, the fire was cold, but the hammer had shifted again an inch lower, its chains drawn tight, and the floor beneath the anvil was marked with ash, shaped like a handprint. Not from a man, from a boy. The fire would not go out. Hatch doused it twice with buckets from the well, even tossed a wet hide over the coals. But each time he turned his back, the forge hissed and bloomed again, as if something beneath the bricks refused to stay quiet. The heat grew stranger, thicker, darker, with no smoke, just a smell like old blood and burnt sugar. The boys whispered about it in the fields. Said the fire had taken root. Said it burned different now, not for tools, but for something else. Jonas never left its side. For 3 nights he stayed there, sleeping in brief folds of shadow, rising at every flare. His skin shone with sweat, but his hands stayed steady. He worked in silence, bending metal into impossible shapes, curling wires into spirals, twisting scraps into knots that seemed more memory than material. When he struck iron, the sound rang different, duller, deeper, like the forge had sunk below the ground and was speaking from beneath the earth. Bellwood noticed. He came stomping down on the second day, already drunk and half-buttoned, demanding to know who gave permission for the forge to run outside schedule. Hatch made excuses, blamed the boys. But Jonas didn't stop hammering, even when the master shouted, even when his voice rose to violence. Bellwood grabbed Jonas by the collar, yanked him backward, but the boy didn't stumble. He turned, just turned, and the heat that rolled off him made the master take half a step back. "You think you're something now?" Bellwood sneered, spittle catching in his beard. "You think fire makes you free?" Jonas said nothing, but the forge behind him cracked loud enough to shake the rafters. Sparks rose in a thin column, dancing toward the hammer above the door. Bellwood's eyes flicked up, just once, and Jonas saw it, the briefest flicker of fear. That night, the fire grew so bright it lit the fields. The slaves in the quarters watched from behind their shutters, silent. The flames bent in strange directions, never licking the walls, only the sky. A few of the women crossed themselves. Others whispered Eli's name. By dawn, the forge walls were covered in ash marks, symbols like the ones Jonas had carved, but now scrawled in soot by no hand. Circles, chains, spirals, a map without compass, drawn by heat alone. Hatch refused to enter, claimed the shadows moved wrong, claimed he saw Ruthie's feet behind the coal pile, just for a blink. The fire would not go out, and no one dared ask Jonas why. It happened on the quietest night of the season, when the crickets stilled and even the dogs slept without twitching. No moon, just clouds thick with the smell of coming rain. The kind of night where you could hear your own heartbeat louder than the wind. That was when the child vanished. Not Ruthie this time. Another. Joseph, the one with the crooked toe and gap between his teeth, the one who never stopped humming. He was there at supper, sitting cross-legged by the fire pit, licking grits from his fingers. He was there when the bell rang curfew. But by morning, the space where he slept was empty, and the blanket still held his shape, like the body had been peeled out. Hatch searched the fields, kicking over feed bins and snapping at the dogs. Bellwood called it laziness, said the boy was hiding, sent the others out to dig. But there were no footprints, no torn fabric, no blood, just a single handprint too small for a man, too perfect for accident smeared in rust-colored grime beneath the master's window. Jonas saw it before anyone else. He stood, staring at it, while the others dug holes that led nowhere. His eyes didn't blink. He didn't move, not even when Hatch barked his name from across the yard. Later that night, Jonas went back to the forge. The fire welcomed him like it had been waiting. The heat folded around him, thick and low. The hammer above the door shifted once, creaking like bone. Jonas stepped inside and sat in the ashes. He pressed his palm to the floor and closed his eyes. What returned wasn't sight or sound, it was knowing. Joseph wasn't far. He wasn't sold. He hadn't run. He was here beneath the boards, inside the heat, part of the forge now, just like Ruthie, just like the others. Taken, but not lost. Remembered. Still warm. The next day, Jonas walked barefoot to the chain tree and tied another red thread around the trunk. This one, tighter, higher. The other children didn't ask. They only watched. One of them, a little girl named Mercy, began to hum Joseph's tune that night without knowing where it came from. The sound of it made Hatch leave the quarters, made him sleep in the stables. Bellwood didn't speak of the handprint. He had it scrubbed clean. But he started locking his door, and when he passed Jonas, he no longer met the boy's gaze, because deep down, even a master can feel when something has shifted beneath his feet. And Bellwood felt it now. Not fear. Not yet. But the edge of it. The sledgehammer had always hung too high to touch. Mounted above the forge door, like a god watching from its altar, its oak handle darkened by age, the iron head still marked with an old dent that no one spoke about. Bellwood called it ceremonial. Said it was passed down from his father and his father before him. Said it had history in it. Jonas never believed that history belonged to Bellwood. He knew from the first time he saw it that hammer had memory, not legacy, and memory could rot into something dangerous if left chained too long. The day he touched it, the sky was the color of rusted tin, and the air pressed against the skin like breath from a mouth too close. The others were out in the fields. Hatch had taken to the bottle early. No one was watching. Jonas stepped into the forge like a man walking into a confession. The fire was low, barely more than a whisper, but the heat still curled against his ribs. He moved slow, each step deliberate, his eyes fixed on the hammer. It swayed slightly on its chains, not from wind, but from something in the room shifting, as if it knew. Jonas didn't reach for it at first. He just stood beneath it, letting its shadow fall over him. Then, with both hands, he placed his palms flat against the wall beneath it and leaned forward. He could feel the heat of the iron above his head, could smell the ancient tang of metal and blood and ash. The hum returned, faint but deep, like breath caught in iron lungs. It vibrated through his bones, matched the beat of his heart. Slowly, he lifted one hand and grasped the chain. It was colder than he expected, not icy, still, like holding the wrist of a corpse. With the other hand, he touched the handle. The oak was smooth, polished from years of watching but never swinging. As soon as his skin met it, the forge went still. The flames dimmed to a glow. Even the smoke froze in place. Jonas exhaled once, low and steady. He did not lift it, not yet. He just held it long enough for the warmth to return, long enough to feel the tremble that lived inside it. It wasn't rage, it wasn't power, it was purpose, waiting. Behind him, something scraped along the wall, A soft, dragging sound. He didn't turn around. He already knew what it was. The forge had begun to breathe, and the hammer had remembered his touch. The bell rang once at midnight. Not twice, not 3 times, just once. A sharp, clear clang that cut through the silence like a blade through linen. It came from the chapel bell, the one rusted crooked at the top of the old white tower near the orchard. No one had touched it in years. It hadn't rung since the last master's funeral, and even then, it took 3 men and a rope soaked in oil to make it move. So when the sound echoed across the fields, it woke every soul on Bellwood land. The quarters stirred in uneasy silence. The children sat up in their beds, wide-eyed, their breaths held like prayers in glass jars. Hatch stormed out with a lantern and a pistol, cursing the wind, his boots too loud in the dark. He went to the chapel, found the rope still tied, the bell swaying on its own. Must be wind, he muttered, though the trees stood still, and the air was heavy with smoke from the forge. Bellwood didn't come out. He heard it too. He sat in his chair by the window, staring at the hammer nailed above his fireplace, a smaller cousin to the one in the forge. He poured himself a drink, but his hand shook too hard to lift it. In the forge, Jonas had not stirred. He stood in the center of the floor, barefoot in soot, eyes locked on the sledgehammer. He had not moved since dusk. The chain that held it creaked softly, like it had stretched a little farther on its own. The fire behind him pulsed with unnatural rhythm, each flare rising and falling in time with the hammer's sway. One clang, that was all it took. Jonas closed his eyes. He could see the map Eli had drawn in his mind, the circle of fire, the chains, the words scrawled in blood. The hand that swings must remember. He did. He remembered the sound of Ruthie laughing. He remembered the chain marks on Joseph's ankles. He remembered the brand on his own skin, and the silence they all carried like lead in the lungs. He remembered the names not said, the bodies not buried, the rooms that echoed without walls. And the hammer remembered too. When he opened his eyes, the forge was glowing, but not from flame. From memory, the walls pulsed with heat. The floor shivered beneath his feet. The hammer hung still now, perfectly balanced, as if it had been waiting for the bell. Outside, the clouds began to split. Rain did not fall. The moon did not shine. But the land felt older suddenly, like it had stepped backward into something it didn't want to become. Jonas looked toward the door, not to leave, to mark the moment. The bell had rung once. That was all it needed. The name was not given. It was taken. Jonas found it etched into the back cover of Eli's Bible, hidden beneath the crumbling leather like a scar never meant to heal. Not Jonas. Not the name Bellwood spat when angry, or the one Hatch slurred through his rotten teeth. This name had been carved in with something sharp, something personal. Abel, not written like a memory but like a warning. Beneath it was a second line, almost erased by time. He who remembers does not die. Jonas traced the letters with a coal-blackened thumb. They felt heavier than the book itself. That night, while the others slept beneath quilts sewn with silence, he returned to the forge. He carried no tools, no thread, just the Bible, wrapped in a cloth, soaked with ash from the graves under the chain tree. The fire greeted him with a low hiss, like it knew, like it had always known. The hammer above the doorway didn't hum. It waited. Jonas stepped into the firelight, unwrapped the book, and tore out the back cover, folded the name in two. Then he climbed onto the anvil, the heat licking his calves, the chain above creaking faintly as the hammer shifted overhead. He reached up slow, steady, and gripped the wooden handle with both hands. The chain groaned, something snapped at the base, and the sledge lowered an inch, then another, until it rested in his palms. The weight of it was unbearable, but it didn't shake him. Instead, he staggered backward, bringing it to the floor with a grunt that wasn't pain. It was memory being exhaled. He turned it over. The oak was smooth, warm, and now finally it belonged to him. He lifted the folded name, pressed it against the handle, and bound it with a strip of red thread, not to decorate, to name, to claim, to bury the falsehood Bellwood had branded into his chest and raise what had always lived beneath. Jonas was dead now, or maybe he never was. Maybe that name had always been hollow, but Abel was something else, something old, something that did not kneel. In the silence that followed, the forge dimmed, the smoke stilled, and the hammer, now named, now chosen, pulsed with heat. Outside, wind stirred the trees near the chain tree. One of the threads broke loose and flew toward the forge like a signal. Abel did not look up. He just knelt beside the hammer and whispered to the floor, "I remember." And beneath the ground, the bones did too. They caught him near the big house just before dawn, crouched low in the grass with ash on his hands and soot beneath his fingernails. Abel didn't run. He didn't even flinch when Hatch spotted him from the porch and let out a garbled yell like he'd seen a ghost wearing skin he thought he'd buried. The overseer came down hard, boots stomping like thunder, whip uncoiled and teeth clenched in a crooked sneer. Abel stood still, arms loose at his sides, the thread of red still tied to his wrist like a mark left on purpose. Hatch struck him once across the back, then again, harder, cursing under his breath about mutiny, about punishment, about silence being no shield from obedience. Abel didn't make a sound, not even when the third lash split open the skin just below his shoulder blade. Blood rose, slow and dark, but his eyes never left the porch steps, where Bellwood now stood with a coffee cup and a pistol tucked into the waistband of his trousers. "Bring him here," the master said, voice flat. Hatch dragged him by the arm, half limping now, breathing through his teeth. Bellwood stared at the boy like something had shifted out of place. "What were you doing by my window?" Abel didn't answer. His mouth stayed closed, his jaw locked, but his stare was steady, sharp enough to draw blood. Bellwood spat into the grass. "You think that hammer gives you power," he said, stepping closer, voice slurring on the edges of sleep and drink. "You think fire makes you untouchable." He raised a hand and slapped Abel across the face, hard enough to turn his head. Blood touched the corner of the boy's mouth. Still, no sound came. "You ain't special," Bellwood hissed. "You just quiet." But he didn't strike again. He stepped back. There was something in Abel's eyes he couldn't explain. Something old. Something that did not belong to the boy, yet burned behind the eyes like coals that refused to cool. Hatch waited for the order to keep going. It never came. Instead, Bellwood waved them off. "Lock him up. Let him stew." So they threw Abel into the grain shed, door barred from the outside, no light but a slit through the wood. The chains on his ankles clinked softly as he sat back against the wall, eyes closed, blood from his back soaked into the dirt. But he smiled, just barely, because the hand that swung had remembered. And now the master had touched it. They left him in the grain shed for 2 days. No food, no water, just dust and the stink of old burlap, with the chains on his ankles rusting deeper into the skin. But Abel didn't suffer. He waited. The quiet was familiar, the dark was warm, and the pain he wore that like a second shirt. Outside, the forge grew cold for the first time in weeks. No one stoked it. No one dared. Hatch refused to enter, said the shadows were crawling now, said he saw Eli's handprint appear on the wall, dripping in ash. Bellwood dismissed it, but his nights grew restless. He started pacing the porch, gun always tucked at his side. The quarters stayed silent, not from fear, from knowing. Abel wasn't missing. He was ripening, and the hammer was waiting. On the third night, as a storm rolled over the trees like a giant dragging chains, the grain shed door creaked open. No footsteps, no key in the lock. Just a click, and then air. Abel stood slowly. His back burned where the lashes had dried into scabs, but his hands were steady. The chains had fallen loose, as if rust had given up holding him. In the doorway, the rain waited, thick and slow, like oil from the sky. Abel stepped into it barefoot, the dirt sucking at his soles. No one saw him cross the yard. The dogs didn't bark. The wind didn't howl. Even the frogs were quiet. He walked into the forge, alone, soaked to the bone. The hammer sat where he left it beneath the frame, wrapped in red thread now dark with memory. He lifted it. No tremble, no ache. It knew him now. The forge groaned once, as if exhaling a breath it had been holding for a century. Abel laid his palm on the stone floor and whispered one name. Not his, Bellwood's. The fire behind him whooshed to life without flame, just light, a low, pulsing heat that glowed through the brick like blood through veins. The symbols on the walls lit up. Every mark he had drawn, every circle, every chain, all humming in the same rhythm. Abel stood, turned to face the doorway, and waited. He knew Bellwood would come. Masters always did when they felt something slipping from their grip. They came to reclaim, to punish, to remind. But Abel wasn't a boy anymore. He was the forge now, and the hammer in his hand didn't remember mercy. Only weight, only sound, only what it was made to do. It happened just before dawn. The rain had passed, but the sky was still swollen with thunder, and the earth slick with mud that smelled like turned graves. Bellwood stormed toward the forge in his nightclothes, pistol drawn, boots half-laced, cursing as he stumbled through puddles that seemed to reach for his ankles. He hadn't slept, not since the hammer vanished, not since the chains fell off the boy who wasn't a boy anymore. "You think you can haunt me?" he snarled into the dark. "You think silence makes you strong?" His voice cracked against the wind, thin and hollow. He shoved the forge door open with one hand and raised the pistol with the other. But the fire didn't greet him with smoke. It greeted him with stillness. Too still. The room was warm, but not from flame. It was the heat of blood, of breath held too long, of judgment. Abel stood in the center, barefoot, shirtless, his back still marked with red, his eyes calm. In both hands, he held the hammer not above his head, not yet but low, like a shepherd's staff. The forge glowed behind him, casting him in a light that made him look older than time, younger than pain. Bellwood froze. The pistol shook. "You don't get to choose," he hissed. "You don't get to make war on me." Abel stepped forward once, just once, and Bellwood's hands faltered. The hammer rose, not quick, not wild, but slow, steady, deliberate, like a sentence being read aloud. Bellwood raised the pistol and fired. The shot rang out like a scream in a church, but it missed. Or maybe it was never meant to land. Maybe the forge bent the air. Maybe guilt made Bellwood's hand tremble. It didn't matter. Abel was already moving. One swing, one arc. The hammer came down like the end of something sacred. It met Bellwood's head with a sound that didn't echo. It landed and stayed. The skull split like wet timber. Bone crunched, blood bloomed. The master fell in pieces, not like a man, but like a structure collapsing. Abel didn't blink. He lowered the hammer to the floor. Behind him, the forge fire roared once, then dimmed to coals. The walls let out a breath. And the chain on the hook, where the hammer once hung, unraveled itself, piece by piece, clinking like a song that had finally ended. Outside, the sky broke open, not with rain, with light. The sun rose slow and red over Bellwood, and the first thing it touched was the forge. The second was the blood trail on the porch. Abel walked outside, barefoot, leaving prints behind him. He did not run. He did not look back. The house stood quiet. The field stood still, and somewhere in the trees, the chain tree creaked, not from wind, but from relief. By morning, the body was cold, and the forge was still. The door hung open, just enough to let in the rising light and the buzz of flies that always came first when death lingered. Bellwood's blood had soaked into the porch planks, dark and thick, pooling in the grooves like it knew how to stay. The pistol lay in the dirt beside him, untouched, useless, and the hammer, Abel's hammer, was gone. So was the boy. Hatch found the body first. He didn't scream, didn't curse, just dropped to one knee and stared like a man trying to understand a story written in a language he never learned. He touched nothing, not the gun, not the blood, not the fragments of bone clinging to what used to be the master's jaw. Then he stood, backed away, slow, and told no one. But the slaves knew. Long before the news reached the quarters, the air had changed. It was in the way the wind moved softer through the cotton, in the way the dogs didn't bark, in the way the fire didn't burn. They gathered in silence. No songs, no stories. Just stood beneath the cypress trees and looked toward the forge like waiting for something to speak. But nothing did. Not yet. That evening, Hatch tried to rally the others. Claimed they had to prepare for riders, for revenge, for the law. But his voice didn't carry the way it used to. He looked older now, hunched under something heavier than fear. One of the old women, Marla, with her crooked spine and clouded eye, just shook her head and said, "Ain't no law comin', not for this." She walked past him, slow and barefoot, and laid a bundle of herbs on the porch beside the blood. A quiet offering. A burial with no grave. That night, no fire was lit, no food was cooked, but the children sat in a circle near the chain tree, tying red thread around stones and whispering names of the lost. Ruthie, Joseph, Eli, one by one. Abel's name was not spoken, not yet, not out loud, but the sky felt different now, stretched thin like skin, healed too fast over a wound that hadn't finished bleeding. In the forge, the walls stayed warm. The ash on the floor didn't settle, and above the doorway, where the hammer once hung, a single red thread now dangled from the empty chain hook, swaying slightly, even though no wind touched it. Abel was gone, but the silence he left behind was not empty. It watched, it waited, and everyone at Bellwood knew what that meant. The hand that swung had not vanished. It had simply passed on. Years passed, but the porch stain never faded. They sanded the wood, scrubbed it with lime, painted it over in whitewash thick enough to blind memory, but when the rain came, it bled through. A dark, rust-colored flower, blooming always in the same spot. The hammer was never found. Some said Abel tossed it into the well behind the stables, the one the water turned red for 3 days after. Others swore they saw him walking toward the forest, barefoot, hammer slung across his back, the chain still dragging like a tail behind him. The most fearful whispered he didn't leave at all, that he simply stepped into the forge one last time and disappeared, swallowed by fire that knew his name. Whatever the truth, Bellwood never recovered. No one claimed the land. No white man would buy it. Too many stories, too many bones. The chain tree rotted slow, but never fell. Red thread still showed up, tied to its roots, fresh and wet, even after long drought. The children, who once whispered in circles, now told their own children, "Don't follow the bell at midnight. Don't touch the wall behind the forge. And never, ever raise a hand that forgets." A new overseer tried to reopen the forge once. His tools rusted in a single day. He left before the week was out. Said he heard knocking in the walls and a low voice humming from the coals. A hymn that never ended. They say Bellwood's last breath still echoes if you press your ear to the anvil. Not a word, a sound wet and final. And some nights, if the wind hits just right, the hammer can be heard swinging in the dark, splitting silence like it's still remembering. As for Abel, his name is carved in no stone, listed in no book. But in Alabama, when the air grows heavy and the dogs won't cross the porch, folks still lower their voices and say it. Jonas was the boy, but Abel was the hand. And the hand that swung, it swings still. If stories like this still haunt you long after the screen goes dark, like and subscribe to The Black Chapter and tell us in the comments, what do you remember that others tried to bury?